You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs. All right, we are back with our next episode. This time we're talking all about injuries, both in yoga and outside of yoga. We're going to start with some information on some stats on injuries in yoga, and then talk about the healing process and how you can influence that, how your practice influences that, ways to work and support injuries, things to keep in mind if you're working with injuries. We'll also take a look at our experience with injuries and experiences teaching classes with people with injuries and asking about injuries, transitions, there are poses that we don't teach, as well as things that we do to help reduce the likelihood of injury during a practice, and a lot more. That's a few of the topics, but I'm excited to kick off this call with Rachel today. And this was actually Rachel's idea. So I am going to let you had some great stats that you pulled first on injuries in yoga. I'm going to let you kick it off there, Rachel.
Thank you. Yeah, this was one that I was really interested to dive into because it's an area where my thought process has changed a lot from when I first started teaching to how I feel about it and how I teach now. And I think a lot of that is just down to timing. Right around the time I did my yoga teacher training, there was this movement in the yoga world that was much more aware of the likelihood of yoga injury. I think there are a lot more people getting into a more physically oriented practice. Power yoga was a really popular practicing style, and there was just a lot more physicality to the practice than perhaps there had been when I was younger practicing by myself. And so I was seeing a lot of information coming out about yoga injuries and how dangerous the practice could be and how we could protect our students and keep them safe. And so that was a big sort of theme in my first couple of years of teaching, of being hyper aware of the risks involved in practice. And as time has gone on, and I've kind of lifted my head to look around in the broader world, I realized that the risks that come up in physical yoga practice are pretty low, really, compared to a lot of the things that we do with our bodies, even just the risks of having a sedentary lifestyle and not moving enough. So my thought process has changed a lot, but I think we'll probably capture a lot of people's interest who are in different phases of thought about this or have had different experiences in their own practice or their own teaching. So yeah, I thought we'd start a little bit with statistics because this was the kind of information that was coming out when I was a newer teacher and very aware of the safety of practice. So
and
there was
I know, sorry to interrupt you, Rachel, but I know right before we started this, we were talking about the notorious New York Times article too. I think it was called How Yoga Can Wreck Yourself. Was it
Wreck Your Body?
Wreck Your Body.
Yeah.
By William Broad. And I remember it made such a big splash. But what was hilarious about it was if you actually read through it, he had nerve damage from sitting in Virasana or maybe Vajrasana. I can't remember which one it was, but sitting on or between his heels for 24 hours. And you're like, I remember reading the article thinking like, that's
why
ridiculous.
Would you do that?
Why would you do that? I think maybe we have some other issue here we need to talk about. But it made such a big splash, and rightfully so, because you can injure yourself doing anything or doing nothing, like you said.
Yeah.
So
yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, there are some risks involved in any physical movement or physical activity. As I said, including not doing any activity at all has its own basket of risks. But there was a study that came out when I was a fairly new teacher called Yoga-Related Injuries in the United States. And it was looking at yoga injuries in hospital emergency rooms between 2001 and 2014. And the big takeaway was that the injury rate had increased over the course of the study, and that injuries had increased most for practitioners that were 65 years or older, mostly sprains and strains. But that was the sort of takeaway statistic from that study. which probably makes sense in that there were more practitioners over 65 than there had been previously.
And I think keep in mind, because we're talking about a hospital setting doesn't necessarily mean that it's an emergency, because a lot of people end up there for whatever reason. Maybe it's a weekend or a nighttime, that this happens, but it doesn't tell us the severity. I mean, the fact that there's sprains and strains is a pretty low severity injury, usually, obviously. But I think it's just important to keep in mind that, of course, like anything, you can definitely injure yourself. Of course. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then there was another survey that was done in 2009. Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons did a worldwide survey of yoga teachers, therapists, and doctors and asked them about the yoga injuries that they'd seen. So this was the injuries that they'd seen ever through the entire course of their life and practice. And the majority were to the lower back, slightly fewer than that were to the shoulder, slightly fewer than that were to the knee, then to the neck. And then there were some very, very rare, more serious injuries. But they were mostly that sort of sprain, strain, and the real transitional joints that kind of make sense to anyone who practices yoga asana, that it would be those load-bearing transitional joints that come up when we talk about injury.
What I think is interesting too is I've always explained it to people, like, my viewpoint is that yoga also uncovers things, as someone who saw patients, I saw even from the very first day I started seeing patients, I saw such a drastic difference between my patients who did yoga and who didn't do yoga. And I think what yoga does as well is it forces us to look at all the different parts. So even as maybe a runner or cyclist, you're only using your body in one very specific way, usually, unless you're, cross training and doing all that stuff. But with yoga, we're moving our body in and hopefully every dimension and all the different ways and exploring all the different movements. And so a lot of it too is uncovering things. Whereas someone who, when I worked at the Nike headquarters, I saw a lot of patients who were super active. It was kind of the extremes. And then some who were not active at all. But the people sitting in their chair in their office that don't do a lot of, or any exercise potentially, who maybe have some lingering injuries that they're able to look past, or some nagging pains that they're able to look past because it's not limiting their function at their desk. But, they go and they start yoga and all of a sudden it comes to the forefront of their brain. So I think it's really hard to even get great numbers on these things because we don't know the context of the people. Is it really coming from yoga? Was it already there? And again, not to say that you can't injure yourself doing yoga, because you absolutely can, of course, just like any physical modality or non-physical, like you said.
Yeah.
But I think context is important too. So yeah.
I love that you brought that up, because there's 2 points there that I think are really worth talking about. One is the different movement planes and positions that we take ourselves into in yoga asana practice. It's one of the big strengths of the practice, but it also does mean that we might be in positions that we aren't in regular daily life, which is a real benefit of the practice. And the other thing is, when we're practicing, what we're really practicing is the capacity to pay attention. And I've had a student tell me previously, since I've been practicing yoga, I almost feel like a hypochondriac because I didn't used to pay this level of detailed attention to how I feel. And every time I show up to practice and I really ask myself, what's going on? How am I feeling? What's going on in my body? What's going on in my mind? I uncover little details of my experience that I would never have noticed in the busyness of life. And again, that's a huge benefit of practice, but it does mean that we notice things that we might not have noticed rushing from, out of bed, have our coffee, go to work, pick up the kids, go home, make dinner, do the washing, go to bed. We might not notice those details.
Yeah. And I can speak to that. I just got my DNA test done looking at propensity towards different things. And my whole family actually did it, which was interesting. Whoa. And it's funny because I'm always kind of, especially now, as like the healthy one in quotes in the family. And there's a lot of metabolic issues and obesity that run really deep in my family. My grandmother died at her, I think, early 50s from obesity related complications. But what was hilarious is when I looked at my genetics, I literally had the worst genetics of everyone in my family by far. Like, I should have the worst metabolism and the worst propensity towards injuries and all the things. And yet here I am. And it's a testament to our epigenetics, of course, and our capacity to thrive, and the importance of what we're about to talk about how we train the tissues and also prevent injuries as well. So,
Mm.
and keep in mind, remember the injuries that we're talking about in these statistics are also mostly acute injuries. There's also chronic injuries. So it's hard to really get numbers on this, but I think we can all agree that we will probably all experience an injury in our lives, whether that's from yoga or yoga uncovered it or something else in your life. I think we'll all practice potentially with some sort of injury. And you know, it's the brilliance of being human. Our bodies are made to heal and repair. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the inflammatory process and the healing process, especially as it relates to the fascia, because the fascia is such an interesting thing. There was a big article that came out, I think it was the end of 2019, by Jan Wilkie, called "Is It All About the Fascia?" And he was looking at muscle strains, injuries, and he was really detailing to see whether they were actually in the fascia or the muscle. And I'm just giving you the short synopsis, but what they found was that I think it was only, I should have pulled up the stat, but I think it was 12 or 13% were in the muscle and the rest were in different parts of the fascial continuum. So the tendon or the musculotendinous junction, et cetera. So what they're finding, and it kind of made a big explosion in the sports medicine world, because now, you know, it's kind of pointing this lens to the fact that for injury prevention, we probably really need to be looking at the fascia, which is really the container of the muscle. The muscle is just contractile fibers that sit in the casing of the fascia. The fascia holds it in place. It connects it to the other, you know, lines along that myofascial continuum. And so the connective tissue is so important when we're talking about healing injuries, preventing injuries. It really comes to the forefront of our attention now, thanks to all of the incredible scientists out there researching the past few decades and bringing this to life. But of course, the health of the connective tissue and the healing of this connective tissue is dependent on a lot of different things, as you might imagine, just like anything in the body, our nutrition, our health in general, functioning cells, the proteins that are signaling messages, the hormones and enzymes. There's so much that goes into just being able to heal well, which is beyond what we're going to talk about now. And then, you know, even when we think about connective tissue, that the blood circulation is really a big part of this, because it's providing and taking away all of those elements too. And it really only extends so far into the tendon. So it's better around the musculature, and it gets less and less so as we go into the tendons and the ligaments, which is why those tend to heal a lot slower. And so that circulation is really important. The connective tissue healing is dependent on that, and especially in those tendons and ligaments. But damage to this fascial tissue in general causes an inflammatory reaction that helps create that healing process. The inflammation is actually a good thing here. It tends to get a bad rap in the world because chronic inflammation is not a good thing when it lingers around. But this initial phase, so once I've had some sort of injury, whatever that is, my body creates this inflammatory reaction that starts to create this healing process. So we've got really three main phases of this healing process that have to happen. The first is the inflammation. And this is really just the first few days or maybe the first week. This all depends on the person and the extent of the injury. But this is a really important protection phase. This is where the immune cells come in to fight pathogens. And there's a weaker form of collagen that starts to be laid down very quickly, our collagen 3, to help kind of create like a matrix or a Band-Aid on top of that wound. There's vasodilation that floods the tissues with red and white blood cells to help clean up and digest waste and regulate clotting, etc. So that's the first phase. And then the second phase is the proliferation phase. And so this one can last anywhere from a month or two, so 4 to 6 weeks, potentially, again, depending on the person and the injury. And this one has a huge development of new blood vessels and new collagen deposition. This is also where the wound starts to contract to heal, to bring those two edges back together. And the fibroblasts are an interesting cell here that starts to create more of this, what's called the extracellular matrix. So this fibrous collagenous layer. And they're excreting collagen 3 again, which is the weaker collagen, and then starting to eventually lay down some of the collagen 1, which is the really strong excuse me, the strong collagen that we want there. So they're also releasing cytokines that signal to differentiate, produce, and then eventually to terminate too. So they're regulating this whole process, upregulating or downregulating it. And we have all sorts of other things happening here. But in this phase, we're creating that irregular collagen or connective tissue matrix to help close the wound. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important here that we have that start to be created. But in this phase, because it's mostly that collagen 3, it's not a strong layer yet. Mm-hmm. So it's important that we, maybe do some gentle movements here, but that we not go too far, because if I go too far and now I maybe tear the tissues, if it was a tear, I have the potential to push it back to that inflammatory phase. And
just a quick question here. Yeah. We're talking about wound closing, but my understanding is not necessarily just an open wound like a cut. Even if you've got sort of internal damage to tissues, we still need that. Yeah, great.
We're talking microscopic too. So the macroscopic and the microscopic for sure.
Great.
So then the really interesting one, I think, is phase 3, which is this remodeling phase. And this one can last for a long time. It could be if you're really diligent with your physical therapy or whatever tactic you use. It could be 6 months, especially if it's not too significant of an injury. But I've seen people who've been in this phase for years and either haven't been very proactive with the work that they've done or haven't had the right guidance or direction. But this remodeling phase, this third phase, so remember that the last phase 2, was just that first 4 to 6 weeks. So we're still only maybe a month or 2 out of the injury. But this is where the fibroblasts now start to replace the collagen 3, the weaker collagen, with the stronger collagen. So, the fibroblasts come in an emergency and they're like, let's just get this cleaned up. We got to do this now, team. And they're calling everyone in and they're laying it down and they've just got this loosely knit matrix, this weaker matrix to seal things up quickly. But now this is where they come in and they refine the process, and the fibroblasts are really trying to create not only this stronger collagen matrix, but this more orderly collagen matrix. So in this injury cycle, there can be crosslinks, which I often just talk about those as kind of this Velcroing between the tissues, because those crosslinks are what develop between layers that should be gliding past each other. And so what's really important in this remodeling phase is that we're loading the tissues appropriately, because again, this has to be a slow, progressive process. But that loading, meaning we're applying some force to the tissue, which force I know sounds aggressive, but really, if I'm standing there, maybe my legs are set up for pyramid, but I'm standing upright. If I just start to lean forward a couple of inches, I'm starting to put some force into those hamstrings. Now, the further I come down, the more force and body weight, of course, I have, because now I'm resisting gravity more as I bend forward more. So there's a whole spectrum of how much I can load the tissues, but that loading is what the fibroblasts listen to. So the fibroblasts hold on to the collagen. And as I'm loading the tissues, they're feeling that pulling, that tugging on them, and they're responding as to how they kind of recreate and remodel this fibrous matrix. So it creates a much stronger, more orderly matrix. And we've got now this more regular connective tissue that is strong along those lines of force. So like the hamstrings, you imagine it, the fibers running up and down along the back of the leg. But again, this can last for years. I've seen so many people with hamstring injuries in the yoga world who've had it for years.
Me.
And some of them continue to stretch and do all the things. So like the first thing is, you got to back off the stretching that's creating that pulling pain. But the second thing is that you need to add in loading to inform these fibroblasts to lay down more collagen, because I need to complete this remodeling phase. It really requires this mechanical stress to guide that neuroinflammatory response. And this part of the healing phase is really susceptible to either incompletion. So there's not enough loading for them to actually finish it. They just kind of get lazy, and the fibroblasts are like, this must be good enough. She's not really doing much anyway. She's just laying on the couch. So we're good here. So, or overload. So they're susceptible. This phase is susceptible to incompletion or overload, meaning I do too much too fast. And that's really the case we were talking about too, is the people who are either so afraid of doing anything because they're injured and then they miss this remodeling phase, or the people who are jumping right in and going through that injury cycle and then kicking themselves right back to the inflammatory cycle over and over and over again.
Yes.
And so, so that
There's
kind of
so much good stuff here. I mean, I really want people to understand this process because, as we said, we all have our own individual tendencies. For some of us, it's to rush in too soon. For others of us, it's to hold back and to be overly cautious. So I really want people to understand when's the right time in the healing process to rest. When is the right time to introduce just general movement and circulation, and then when is the right time to be loading? So just run through them again to be completely clear.
Let me just talk about the rest thing, because I mean, I'm such an advocate of rest, and I do think rest has an important place. However, movement is what's guiding all of these phases to some extent, because the fibroblasts are active from phase 1 to phase 3, even though they're doing different things. So, for phase 1, when there's that inflammatory cascade, obviously I want to be careful about doing too much, but just simple walking and moving obviously can be really important, which is why, I know when I started seeing patients almost 20 years ago now, people came out of surgery and it was like, oh, you've got to wait so long to walk. And nowadays, even the past 5 or 10 years, surgeons, it's like, you're walking right away because of this, because of what we're talking about, because we know that this loading is what drives those responses within this connective tissue system, that we need that loading in order to inform those fibroblasts to recreate this matrix, which is so important for our resilience, for our healing, for durability of the tissues.
So rest is like a relative concept. If you were, running mountains last week before you sprained your ankle, maybe you won't be running mountains in week 1, but you might still be walking or moving around the house and encouraging good circulation and hydration and just keeping all of the wheels nicely greased. So rest doesn't mean bed rest, but it's relative to the load you had before.
Yeah, and maybe it could mean, and it kind of depends on the injury, right? That was a great way of putting it. But maybe that first phase is a good time to rest from your yoga practice, especially if you're not really sure what is good or bad for, the injury, which we'll talk a little bit more to later. But, sometimes just requires an outsider's input, whether that's a healthcare provider or a yoga teacher who has trained in working with injuries. But the proliferation phase, so again, it's a spectrum. There's more rest at the beginning, less in the middle. And then even in that third phase where we're remodeling, rest is a hard way of judging, because in that remodeling phase, I am still going to start pretty gentle. So that might be just 5 or 10 minutes of, loading work a couple times a day, maybe, or even once or 3 times a day, depending on what's going on. But obviously at the beginning, that seems like nothing for most people and will feel like rest. And this is the hard thing for athletes too. When I work with athletes, it's like getting them to actually feel like this is the thing, this is the training, this is the exercise to replace their normal stuff. It's definitely a spectrum. And then taking that slowly and increasing, giving the tissues time to respond, increasing slowly over, with the remodeling phase over weeks, not over days.
And I think education here is the key, whether we're yoga teachers and people have come back to class after an injury, whether you're working with athletes, the way to get people to buy in is to understand the healing process. So they're not going to buy into this being the thing unless they understand why that's the thing. So this is something I do really talk to people about. If I'm teaching a group class and someone comes and says, oh, I might look a little bit odd today, I sprained my ankle yesterday, that would be the occasion for me to talk to them and say, look, or maybe it was last week, it feels fine now. So I'm back in practice. And I would use that as an opportunity to say, it feels fine because the initial phase of healing has started and your body's put down some really light scaffolding, but it's not the permanent stuff yet. So just be aware of how far you're challenging that really light scaffold. Think of it as kind of cobwebs, and then later there'll be much stronger scaffolding around it. So watch your range of motion, create a sense of support around that joint. And then as time goes on, you can increase the challenge. But I think helping people understand that there are phases to healing. I think people, carry on.
Well, I was just going to say the language is important. I like the words you use, but we'll talk to that later, I think, rather than talking to that now. I just think the time frame is important because when we talk about muscles we can train in the course of strength training in the course of usually 5 to 8 weeks is the general rule of thumb. Whereas fascia is changing over the course of usually 6 to 12 months is usually the numbers that float around. Again, there's a lot of variability between people and contexts. But it's just important to keep in mind that this remodeling phase is happening slowly. So if I'm increasing that load, I really want to be trying to find a daily practice to help load those tissues gently at first. Like the pyramid one is sometimes a good one. Although there's even easier ways to load the hamstrings at first. But, like maybe I'm just going a couple of inches forward for the first few weeks. And then it's another inch a few weeks later, it's so small. And then at some point, those start to accrue more and more. And you find that the returns are kind of amplified. But I just really need to take time because I find the biggest mistake that people make is they go too quick or they get bored and they stop.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about the difference between acute injuries and chronic injuries. I think people understand that distinction, but I do see a kind of pattern. I've had this myself and I've seen it in students of an initial acute injury becoming a chronic one when they don't allow it the full time to heal and don't do that really specific directional loading to encourage the collagen to, work the way we want it to.
I can't tell you how many people I see, how many patients I see that have gone through just that cycle of having an injury and never fully repairing it. And they start to even identify with it and feel like it's just this thing that they're going to have forever. That's who they are. And, it is important to understand the cycle a little bit so you can explain it and empower them. I mean, there's no guarantees because everyone's different. So, it's not like I'm totally trying to erase that or change their mind right away because, we all have our beliefs and ideas, but to just help them understand how the body works. And what's brilliant about the connective tissue system is that it's always adapting in response to demands or lack of demands.
Yeah.
And so I always have the option to intervene and shift the system. It's not going to be the one that shifts instantly. It's the things that I do regularly over time. It's the loading, the strength work. And again, when I'm saying loading, most of what I'm talking about is using body weight to create more of this strength work that we do in yoga. And so, I can't tell you how many people I see. I see so many people when I used to see 60 plus patients a week. So many of those people had chronic injuries that just had never been fully healed. And I see it a lot in the yoga world too.
Yeah.
Especially with those.
Yeah, I was definitely that person. That was exactly what I was going to go to. My experience of this sort of cycle was with my hamstrings when I was working a desk job. So I would sit at least 10 hours a day, sometimes longer. And then I was preparing for my yoga teacher training. And in my mind, that meant I had to practice every day and get really flexible. So I did a lot of hamstring stretching. And lo and behold, that hamstring tendon irritation right around my sit bone just kept coming back and coming back. And it didn't matter how much I stretched it, it wouldn't go away. And then I would run and it would feel a little better, but then I would go back to sitting and practicing and it would feel a lot worse. And it just, this cycle that I kept getting myself into because I didn't understand, which phase I needed to back off from that pulling, stretching sensation, when it was important to start reintroducing strength, especially given I was sitting on those hamstring attachments for hours of every day. Yeah.
I mean, I think we all go through that, hopefully in a mild context, right? But sometimes the best way to learn is firsthand. As yoga teachers, especially, maybe not all students, but I know as a yoga teacher, some of my greatest gifts have been my injuries. Not that I felt that way at the time, but what I will say is just to squash that, what you said about, yoga teachers feeling like they have to be flexible. I will
Yeah.
say, as both as a student, as well as someone who trains a lot of teachers, that a lot of times the people who are less flexible are often naturally better teachers because they get it.
100%.
They get what it's like to adapt and to modify. I remember when I first started teaching at my teacher training, my friend was a running coach and he was very tight. He would sit in Baddha Konasana and his knees would be at like way up toward the sky.
Yeah, like a normal person.
I had to constantly ask him how to modify things because I had no idea. My body was very flexible. That was the easy part for me. The strength took a lot of work, but yeah. And so I think coming to this practice, it's such a I think a misnomer that you need to be well, obviously you need to be flexible
100%.
Yoga, but to be a teacher.
This was years ago. Yeah, this was years ago. And day one of my teacher training, they disabused me of that notion pretty quickly by going, girl, you got to start using your muscles. You got to create some support around your joints. And they were 100% right. But I was mostly practicing by myself in my bedroom. So there were a lot of things I had told myself that didn't turn out to be true, like a lot of times in life.
I did a lot of that. Practicing
don't we all?
Like there were no yoga studios at the time, so you just, you get a book, you're like, oh my gosh,
I'll do this pose.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can make this shape. So yeah, I think we've hit a lot of the really common stuff that it's often, at least in the context of yoga, these tendon injuries, the kind of chronic, niggly, repeated things that perhaps from lack of knowledge or lack of education, we haven't been taking through those phases of healing in a really deliberate way.
Yeah. And, I just realized that I didn't even mention, that connective tissue includes all of those. I kind of alluded to it, but connective tissue is what creates our tendons. It's our ligaments. And it's even our cartilage, and our bones are a type of connective tissue, even our blood, which kind of explodes your brain the first time you hear it. But then we also have the fascia, which is kind of what we think about as the connective tissue, which is wrapping both around the muscle and through the muscle layers and around the blood vessels and the bones and everything, to act as these kind of containers and connectors. And so just keep in mind that when we talk about connective tissue, we're talking about all of those different layers, and it happens a little differently, in the cartilage and the bone, but it's very similar. Everything's, a little more specific to the type of tissue, but, we're talking to all of those are types of connective tissue when we look at that healing process. So it's fairly similar throughout those to some extent.
And the other thing that I want to pull out from your taking us through the healing process is that full remodeling of our fascia takes a long time. So those initial phases go pretty quickly, but the entire process can last, months, a couple of years even. And I think that's hard for us to wrap our heads around, because we think that thing I did to my hamstring was weeks ago. I should be good by now. And you are.
But keep in mind it can. But you can also enhance that. I mean, there's a lot of professional athletes that can really nail those numbers down to very, very small numbers, potentially compared to us, by, doing all the things they need to. I mean, they're spending all day long trying to heal and repair, and, injections and nutrition and supplements, and also the loading. The loading is the one thing you can't get away from. You can do all the injections and nutrition and supplements you want, but if you're not loading those tissues, those fibroblasts ain't going to listen. So it's all required. There's definitely ways to amplify it and take that number down quite a bit. So just being diligent with what you're doing, those loading exercises you can do a couple times a day. If you notice you're getting sore afterwards, you might back it off. But for most people, depending on the injury, of course, it's so hard. You can't really be prescriptive without seeing a person and doing an intake, but doing that loading several times a day can be really helpful. Again, gently, not overdoing it, taking your time to progress, and being really diligent. So the pitfalls are the boredom. Pitfalls, which either makes you stop doing it or do too much. So that really is the big thing.
thinking about athletes can be challenging because you might say, so-and-so broke his arm and he was back on the field in 6 weeks. So remember that they have a team of experts helping them get ready. And also maybe their priority isn't full and complete healing, but getting back to performance level. It's a different thing when it's your job than if it's your body. But all of that said, the difficulty of giving people specific advice, this is probably a really good time to mention that if you do have an injury of some kind and you want to get back to your yoga practice or back to your sport or back to your life, it really is worth having a session with a yoga teacher or somebody who's educated to kind of guide you through that process to help you figure out, what am I doing? What am I not doing? What are those little exercises I could be doing twice a day to start that loading process?
Yeah. And, I often encourage both our teachers and my students and patients in those first, 6 weeks, in those first 2 phases to really focus on their physical therapy because most people have that covered under their health insurance or whatever their medical guidelines are in their country that they live in. So most people can get access to that. However, for most people, and again, it is different places, that physical therapy runs out pretty quickly. And it usually is during those first 2 phases. And so once I get past those first 2 phases, it's a little easier to work with people because it's a little less specific to the injury. And, I can just kind of slowly progress. And so this is where a yoga teacher, I think, becomes really powerful and helpful. And, it's just a matter of finding a yoga teacher who has some training working with injuries. And it's why we go to great lengths to provide our Find a Teacher page on the Yoga Medicine platform so that people can, search in their area and even see what trainings they've done to find someone who can be helpful. And now that everyone's online, even if there's not someone in your place, you can find one of our therapeutic specialists, which means that they've completed a whole lot of trainings with us, including the orthopedic ones usually, which would be hip, shoulder, spine, but to do and meet with someone online. And like Rachel's kind of mentioned a moment ago, not everyone has the means or the time to invest in one-on-one sessions. However, if you're able, even just 1 or 2 where you can meet with someone and they can give you some guidelines, or maybe even just meeting with them every couple of months as you progress so that you can check in. Like, it doesn't have to be a lot. Ideally, it'd be great to meet with someone once a week and be able to check in and refine as you go, but it doesn't have to be that. So
if you go in with some good specific questions and you get a takeaway of some homework that you can do, one session could be enough to take you for a good few weeks, months, 2 months, and an idea of where you want to head after that. I'd agree with that.
Like if I'm seeing someone with a hamstring injury, I can easily just see them once a month or once every couple months, because really it's up to them just doing that nitty gritty work every day. Again, it's usually just a few minutes. It's not a lot, but doing that every day and being persistent about it is
as every physical therapist who's listening to this would be like, but people don't really do their homework. And it's true.
The hard part. But I really believe that's where the education, and this is why at Yoga Medicine, I think, not only do we train our teachers to really understand the body at a deeper level so that they can individualize it, but also so that they can educate their students. Because for me, not for everyone, but I find for a lot of people, understanding it, like, how can I do that thing? You want me to do something every day for months and I don't totally understand it? There's no way I'm going to do it. But if I have this idea in my head, okay, this is what's going to help me heal. It's going to make the tissue stronger. It's going to help me lay down more collagen. I just have to do it every day. And then in my head, it's like, okay, I get why. I need to know why. Otherwise, I'm not going to do it. I mean, that's just human nature.
100%.
I don't blame them.
And on the yoga teacher's side, we can do some odd little things that maybe your physical therapist wouldn't think about. Like when I'm healing, I like to visualize all of the collagen fibers being organized in the direction of load and tidying up that kind of haphazard first aid that the body slap down the band-aids. And I like to visualize everything cleaning up and tidying up and becoming not just stronger, but more directional. And, we know how powerful the mind is. If we can harness our mind and our intention in the healing process, gosh, I feel like there's nothing we can't do.
I agree 110%. And honestly, I think that's part of what the education does. It creates that visualization. It's like a healing map to get them back to where they need to be. So Yeah, I totally agree. And, we've all experienced this. We've all
Mm.
had, again, like we mentioned before, injuries, whether that's from yoga practice or not. I know, it's hard sometimes to decode what was from the yoga practice and what was everything else or what showed up in the yoga practice. Sometimes those poses are kind of just the cherry on top. I know when I herniated my disc, it's been probably a dozen years now. I had just finished fourth series in Ashtanga, which is totally ridiculous. Um, but to each his own. It was fun. It was entertaining. But I remember it was right in the shower after my practice, but I don't necessarily think that it wasn't anything I did. I had a great practice that day. It felt wonderful. I was bending over to grab the soap in the shower and boom, there it was. This intense pain that I can't describe, but I also believe it was me standing over patients all day long. I mean, I'd wake up at 4 a.m. I would teach Mysore and then I would go and I would practice and then I would teach Mysore and then I would go see 60 to 70 patients a week. And then I would teach in the evening sometimes, and you're needling, you're doing acupuncture and body work and you're bending over people. So, anyways, it's so hard to tell, what exactly is what. And maybe it was the yoga. I mean, there definitely, I learned a lot after I moved away from Ashtanga and got leg strength, which I didn't really have before. I had a lot of flexibility, but not a lot of strength. Um, so like it's hard to tell. Was it from the
Mm.
practice? Was it not? I know we had this conversation before and you had that same kind
Yeah.
of feeling.
And the last injury that I had, I got in bed. I was pushing into the back of my head to move my legs in bed and I tweaked my neck. Now, is going to bed too dangerous for anyone? Can going to bed wreck your body? No, it can be just the last straw. It can be the last little thing.
And I call those often like the chronic acute injuries. They're, the things that we know, like as a yoga teacher, you hear someone say that and you know that it wasn't them pushing their head into the bed. This was something that's probably been coming on for a long time. And there was just the cherry on top. And maybe, and I often think of the health of the connective tissue here too. And nervous system could be part of it. All of these things that are important. So, and the flip side, I think we've probably all, if you've taught long enough, had a student who's been injured while you were teaching. And I don't necessarily think that's the fault of the teacher.
It feels that way at the time, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's hard. And we were talking about this before, and I can't, thank goodness for me, I can't remember one specifically, though I know I'm sure people have, and I'm sure they're probably even nice about it and maybe don't tell me because people want to please the teacher, right?
Yeah.
But this is where I think as yoga teachers, it's our job to really instill accountability because in a group class, there's no way I can know what's perfect for everyone in the class. And, the more I can ask questions and offer options, the more they can then start to be accountable and listen because this is the yoga practice, right? It's our self-awareness. It's our ability to now listen because who knows better than us? No one.
And this is, I think, when you've reminded me of a really vivid experience where I feel like for me, the pendulum started to shift from being a teacher who was trying to keep her students safe to somebody who started to see that we all have our own sense of personal power on the mat. And I went to a weekend workshop, and partway through the weekend workshop, one of the participants, most of us were yoga teachers, put up her hand and said, wow, we really are at the mercy of our teachers, aren't we? And I still remember being like red, yellow, and then white hot. And I was like, oh, absolutely not. Not in the context of, getting ourselves into a shape that we shouldn't be in or doing a pose or a movement that we shouldn't do. We are 100% empowered to make decisions in our practice. We're not at the mercy of our teachers in that sense. My goodness, I just remember that being a real shifting point for me of, hey, I can educate my students. And I do say specifically at the beginning of every class, what I'm offering is a sequence that I created, but I don't know how you're feeling today. So add things in, leave things out, move more quickly, move more slowly, take a break if you need one. But I wish people didn't need that permission. I wish people would just know that it's their practice and they're in charge.
It's so important. And I'm so glad to see more of this show up in yoga now, this making it more accessible and offering options for people. I really think that's changing a lot. There's always some people that just like to be told what to do. I mean, I think there is in some ways, something really calming sometimes to just being told you're going to fold your blanket exactly this way. You're going to take your legs into this exact angle. You're going to exactly do it. And, to each his own. And I hope that people, even in those scenarios, can realize that their body is their body. One of my favorite things to say in a yoga class when we're usually in a yin pose is to, ask people to take a picture of themselves. Imagine if you took a snapshot of yourself and put it in the yoga book, and that was like the perfect shape. And all of a sudden it changes how you feel in it when you realize like, this is my pose. This is my body, because your body is not my body. We have different bones. We've been through different lives, different events in our lives. Like, how can we expect the poses to look the same? The books are just a reference. And so
there's nothing to measure ourselves up against and come up short. There's nothing to strive for. We're there already.
And empowering them with that agency to be able to choose and decide, I think is such an important thing. But there's also a fine line between options and chaos, right?
Yeah.
And that's always the tricky part when you're a teacher and you've got like, you're leading something and someone's doing handstands in the back and like,
yeah, I've definitely had Shavasana before where someone's working their core. And I feel like, well, no, now is the time to be quiet. But yeah.
I always just feel bad when I see that because I'm like, you deserve rest. You need it.
You deserve rest.
I love you. I want to like hug them when I see that.
Please rest.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.